Dialogue at the Wilson Center is a production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. And now here's your host, John Molesky.
Hello and welcome to the Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. Each week, Dialogue explores the world of ideas and issues in international affairs, history, and culture. This week, we convene our Africa Roundtable for a discussion of the ways in which technology is stimulating impressive economic development on the African continent. Our guests are Steven McDonald, Director of the Wilson Center's Africa Program and the Project on Leadership and Building State Capacity. Tim Kelly, Lead ICT Policy Specialist at InfoDev, a program within the World Bank. Dr. Kelly specializes in the economics of information and communication technologies and has written or co-authored more than 30 books on the subject. Also joining us from San Francisco is Nmachi Jidenma, founder of Celebrating Progress Africa. Previously, she served as Google Africa's outreach manager for Google Plus and was the Africa editor for The Next Web. I want to welcome all of you to Dialogue. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Very good to be here.
I want to begin. Some of the titles, particularly in the technology sector, can be a little jargony. So let's help our listeners and viewers sort through those. Nmachi, can I begin with you? Tell us about Celebrate Progress Africa, or CP Africa, as you call it. What's the organization do?
No problem. CP Africa is focused on African trends and analysis, analyzing trends in African business, technology, and culture, especially around positive developments on the continent. So in the past few years, for instance, there's been an increase in awareness about a number of positive developments across the African continent, especially focused around mobile technology. And so our goal is to bring these developments to the global sphere and disseminate it amongst investors, entrepreneurs, and business people interested in the continent.
And I know that's your targeted audience. What do you know about your actual audience? Who are the people who are visiting your site and reading the information and looking at what you've got to offer?
Great question. So we're predominantly popular actually in Africa. We're headquartered in Lagos, Nigeria, and also in San Francisco. And so a lot of our audience is actually comprises of developers on the continent, entrepreneurs who are interested in starting technology ventures and understanding the landscape. And so that forms the core of our base. And then we have an increasingly rising base that includes investors and foreign entrepreneurs who are increasingly interested in Africa.
Okay, thank you very much. Tim, I want to ask you a similar question about InfoDev. What is InfoDev?
InfoDev is the Information for Development program at the World Bank. It's what we call a global public partnership. So the World Bank is working with partners, donors in particular, such as USAID, DFID of the UK, Danida from Denmark, in developing programs for and with developing countries in the field of information and communication technologies. My own role there is as a lead ICT policy specialist. So my specialization is in information and communication technologies, the regulation, policymaking thereof.
Now, in my introduction of you, I stated that you authored or co-authored 30 books on the subject matter. More than some people have read who claim expertise in the area. How long have you been at this as a focus?
I've been working with the World Bank since 2008 and previously was with the International Telecommunication Union in Geneva, part of the United Nations organizations. One of the books that we've authored recently is the transformational use of ICTs in Africa, which looks at how technologies such as mobile phones in particular are transforming African life and society.
And how are these resources available?
It's on the web. If you go to the website www.etransformafrica.org, then it's available free of charge.
Great. Steve, I would be a bad colleague if in an opportunity to provide a plug for the Africa program. Why don't you tell our viewers and listeners about the program and its
Well, I will, but first I have to say I sit in awe here between these two experts on information technology because full disclosure must make me say
feeling a little Luddite right now?
I'm feeling very Luddite right now. But the Africa program, as you well know, but for our listeners and for Tim and our other guest, is that there's sort of two areas that we focus on. One is public policy outreach here in Washington to better engage and inform the policy community on Africa. And that's done through a series of conferences, public policy debates, publications, scholarship, including something I'm very proud of, what I call the Southern Voices Network, which is a network of Africa-based policy and research institutes that we have formed who are looking at various issues, and those run across the board from conflict to climate change adaptation to maternal health, et cetera, et cetera. On the other hand, we are also involved on the continent in post-conflict resolution, in peacebuilding, the broader categories it's called these days. And I have offices in Burundi and the Democratic Republic of Congo, and we've worked in Liberia and elsewhere where we're in post-conflict situations, and we're working to rebuild trust and collaborative capacity amongst leadership levels in those societies.
Great. Thank you, all of you, for telling us about your organizations and your work. Now I want to start diving in a bit to the topic and looking at an Ernst & Young report that said Africa is home to what is probably the fastest growing consumer class in the world. And then also impressively, 7 African nations are among the top 10 fastest growing economies on planet Earth. This is impressive numbers, and I'd like to have each of you weigh in initially on what you think is the story behind these numbers. What's driving this growth? Machi, let's begin with you again, if we could.
Sure, no problem. So I think you kind of touched on the Ernst & Young report, and you're wondering what's driving this growth. I think what has been very impressive about Africa in the past decade has been the dramatic decline in conflict. A lot of African countries have always had a lot of massive potential over decades, and lots of analysts have analyzed this. But in the past decade, this is when the continent has found significant progress in terms of the amount of conflict across board. And basically, this is giving more bandwidth to governments across the continent to really implement policies that have driven some of the growth that Ernst & Young mentioned in the report. And it's significant because of the population size of many of the African continent as a whole, and countries like Nigeria and South Africa, for instance, which is the continent's largest economy. With the decline in conflict, it gives bandwidth for this massive population size to really tap into its potential. And so, the sky's the limit, essentially, because with the absence of conflict, it means that a lot of the potential that has been analyzed in the past 20, 50 years can actually come to fruition.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sky's the limit, and that seems to be the general feeling. And then when you can create some stability, you create an environment where people can begin to reach those potentials.
Absolutely. Stability, good governance are all platforms for faster economic growth. And what we've seen in Africa during the course of the 2000s is growth rates just below 5% per year in terms of GDP, which is twice the level that was achieved in either the 1990s or the 1980s. So something remarkable happened in Africa in the 1990s, in the 2000s. And obviously, as you said, peace and stability is part of that. But also technology is playing an important role. During that period between 2000 and now, we've seen the number of mobile phones in Africa grow from fewer than 20 million to more than 650 million. It's a transformation.
What's the time period of that growth again?
Between 2000 and 2012.
Wow, in a decade.
Yeah, just over a decade.
Steve, why have African nations in this regard been more immune to the global economic downturn?
Well, that's an interesting question. I mean, first of all, I agree with my colleagues in terms of why things have changed. I would add one thing. I'm not directly answering your question yet. I'd add one thing, and that's Tim put his finger on it actually, and then corrected himself, and he shouldn't have. The real changes started in the 1990s, the end of the Cold War, the opening up of societies, so that we were still dealing with a lot of the old autocratic rule and a lot of corruption, still are, of course. But what happened was the beginning of a growth of civil society. in the 1990s. As you know, I wrote an article recently called the Long Africa Spring, based on, of course, the current Arab Spring attention. But the reason for it is because that spring has been going on for a very long time. It's part of what's happened, of course, is a stability that my colleagues are talking about, the growth of education, of health, public health services, and et cetera, which is doing a lot of things in terms of stabilizing the societies, but also is bringing back to the continent an awful lot of young, technically savvy people. So that's a part of your consumer class, but it's also part of the class that's driving the technology. So I think that's critical. And what was the question?
I think the question was about why Africa is growing at a time where many other economies are reeling.
Well, I don't know if I really adequately know the answer to that question, and one of my colleagues might offer it. I think partly their banking systems, of course, weren't tied in the way that European and American banking systems were to toxic loan systems and things like that. So there was no bubble to burst. They were impacted by it, of course, but it wasn't the immense impact that we felt in the decade past.
You're a very polite guest, Steve. Most guests, when they ignore a question, just ignore the question. And they don't acknowledge that they've ignored the question. Let's get into some specifics, and I'd ask each of you again to offer up. We have a bad habit in my estimation of talking about Africa as one thing, when of course it's a continent filled with many countries, and we compare it one-to-one to other countries, which is also part of the problem. So let's begin to slice and dice. And if each of you could give us some examples of where we're seeing this development through technology, which countries have notable examples of progress and specific applications of specific technologies. Machi, do you want to begin with that? What are you seeing on the ground as far as where people's lives are really changing and where economic growth is changing the nature of the country itself?
Sure. So, the notable example, which has been going on for the past, say, 2-3 years, has been Kenya. Kenya has been a front runner in terms of, mobile financial inclusion, as well as in terms of homegrown technology that has been successfully exported to the world. The two most popular examples, obviously, have been M-Pesa and Ushahidi, a crowdsourcing technology that emerged out of Kenya. M-Pesa obviously was very inspiring and very motivating as a technology that came out of Africa, mostly because over 80% of Africans remain unbanked, and the fact that M-Pesa was able to include many Kenyans who didn't have access to a bank account and empower them with an account via the mobile phone was something that was very inspiring, because it took the successes from the mobile revolution in Africa and was able to actually drive real development in the financial sector. Ushahidi is another very inspiring example, mostly because of how it came to be. It was founded after springing from post-election violence in Kenya, and was basically out of the need for a group of Kenyan technologists who were looking for ways to map violence in the country. It was very successful for that specific use case, but the fact that it was effectively deployed for the earthquakes in Haiti, for instance, it has been used in Jordan, it's regularly used by Al Jazeera, it's very heavily used in the San Francisco Bay Area by people interested in development around the world. It has just been a very, very inspiring use case and example for how a homegrown African technology developed by Africans can be exported to the world and used widely and globally.
What about other examples that you might bring to
the
table?
I'm tempted to also talk about Kenya, because I think
Kenya is the hub.
Yeah, it is emerging as a regional hub. But let me talk about a country that's next door to Kenya. Let's talk about South Sudan, the world's newest nation, a country only founded as recently as 2011, and coming out of 20 years of conflict that killed an estimated 2 million people. If ever you were to look for poverty in the world, it would be in South Sudan. But the story of mobile communications in South Sudan is actually quite remarkable. There are 5 active mobile phone companies in South Sudan at the moment. Some of them are big names, some of them are quite local, but they've developed organically. They provide a relatively good service. The level of penetration of mobile phones is approaching 30% of the population, and it's transforming people's lives. Although it's not true to say that all of South Sudan is covered with mobile signal, an estimated 85% of the population is already reached, and that's quite transformational in nature.
Mm-hmm. What are some of the examples that jump out to you, Steve?
Well, particularly in the area of peace building and conflict resolution where I've been involved. I know this doesn't get to the economic question immediately, but sort of in democratic transitions, you've seen the involvement of information technology quite dramatically over the last decade. And I can cite several examples from Liberia to Burundi to Nigeria to Senegal, where and Kenya too, of course, in this past election, but where the use of the cell phone, because we must remember that part of the reason why mobile technology is taking off so fast in Africa is because it's cheap, it's available to everyone, and because there aren't alternatives. In some of these countries I just named, like Liberia and Burundi, there is no landline telephone, so you wouldn't have the alternative on the telephone anyway. You have very little access to the internet for just regular internet work, and where you do, sometimes it's dial-up, so it's so slow that it's excruciating. But the use of mobile technology in terms of coordinating election processes, of reporting results, of tracking and monitoring, has played a major role in each of these countries that I've just named, and others as well.
Along these lines, the notion of how this is affecting quality of life. You can see impressive economic numbers. You see in the United States, the stock market surging, and yet chronic high unemployment, real income down for big chunks of the population. Is the type of development that's occurring through technology in Africa making its way to individuals? Is it a democratic type of rising tide, or is this, like we see in other places, the numbers don't quite match the reality on the ground?
We're seeing mobile phones used more and more in helping people to find jobs, and once they have a job, helping them to hold on to that job and helping them to become entrepreneurs. We've at InfoDev recently conducted a study of mobile use at the base of the pyramid in a number of countries in Africa, and we've documented how individual traders are actually using mobile phones in very innovative ways. For instance, someone in a big city selling clothes might use their mobile phone to get pictures, photographs of imports that have just arrived at the port. They may also use their mobile phone for keeping accounts and, of course, for keeping track of customers. So mobile phones are being used in very innovative ways to support employment, new types of employment.
I'm sorry, Steve, go ahead.
Well, it even goes further than that, because they're using the mobile phones to track pricing, both for sales and for purchase, so that they can compare pricing and they can bring together groups of small entrepreneurs or producers in the farming community and et cetera, so that they can share pricing information and go in with a stronger position when they're taking it to market. This is really standard. It's being done all over the place, and it includes financing as well, microfinancing done through mobile technology, where you can particularly do the banking through it. Yeah.
Uh-huh. And Machi, another impressive number, and this can cut both ways, as both a positive or a negative, is the surge of youth population, the enormous growth of people under the age of 40 on the African continent. 1.1 billion will be working age by 2040 or 2040, which would be bigger than China's workforce. What are we seeing as far as impact on young people in particular? And are these jobs that are emerging through technology, are they sustainable?
Good question. I liked how you kind of prefaced that it can either be a positive or a negative, because that's honestly the reality. There's a lot of youth unemployment in many African economies, especially in a large economy like Nigeria. Nigeria, for instance, a phrase that's often used is that the country's true wealth is not its oil, but its youth. But at the same time, even though there's a massive number of young people, at the same time, if adequate jobs are not provided for them, it's basically a ticking time bomb that can end up being catastrophic if the government doesn't provide jobs fast enough and make sure that young people are gainfully employed. In terms of the number of jobs that are currently provided via technology, I think it's still a niche space at this time, and I can speak to Nigeria because that's where I'm from, and I've seen what's on ground. There's been a lot of talk about it, both from the research space. Technologists have explored various models and various interesting ideas, but it's not something that has gone mainstream yet. And there's a very, very strong need for strong, realistic solutions to mass unemployment. Technology can provide solace for this, but I don't think it's something that has really trickled up to the government yet. It's not something that the government is embracing as a long-term tangible solution for unemployment. And if they continue to not take this seriously, it's something that could end up being disastrous, giving violence in some parts of the country, for instance. And yeah, it's just something that should be taken seriously, especially since technology can solve a lot of problems. One area that I see a lot of prospects for is in terms of creating technology platforms that can link African youths to employment opportunities on the web. So things like freelance writing opportunities or opportunities that kind of embraces what global platforms such as Odesk have done. If there are platforms that can link young people in Africa who have basic skills to employers around the world who are basically looking for people who at least have a graduate education, it could go a long way into putting money in the pockets of lots of youths on the continent who are currently not gainfully employed.
Thanks. Tim, another type of issue that can cut both ways, like a very large young population, is external involvement in the affairs of another country. In this case, whether it's private corporations investing, or whether it's governments investing, or whether it's institutions like the World Bank. And this can cut both ways because we've seen these land grabs that are going on around the world that may or may not be good for the locals in the long run. If you could talk to us about that in the context of our discussion, who are the key external players that are having a major impact in Africa, in the good way, the way we're talking about development through technology, but also the unintended consequences?
The countries getting involved are exactly the ones you would expect, China, India, European Union, North America, etc. We've seen a great rise in foreign direct investment in recent years, but I think one of the more remarkable factors is that many of the largest mobile phone companies in Africa are actually African-owned companies like MTN, etc. Certainly there is an important role for the international investment community to play, but equally I think it's important, particularly for organizations like the World Bank, that we build up indigenous skills and indigenous capabilities.
Mm-hmm. And Steve, Tim was the first to bring up the notion of good governance as being part of the equation. What are we seeing in that regard? Are we seeing more regional cooperation, more integration?
We're working towards that. It's a goal that I think a lot of us share. The Africa Union, UN Economic Commission on Africa, African Development Bank, and a lot of us who are working on Africa. It's I think a critical element that if we don't have regional economic integration, if we don't begin to drop trade barriers, intra-Africa trade barriers, both tariff and non-tariff, that we're kind of shooting ourselves in the foot. That a lot of the opportunities that open internationally for trade and investment get stymied internally because there's no value added to anything coming out of Africa because you can't move across borders except at great expense. It's an area that I think our government doesn't give enough attention to, and that's another issue altogether. We tend to approach things multilaterally. I wish we could, and I'm working in conjunction with former Prime Minister of Italy, Romano Prodi, and the Africa Union Chair, Dlamini Zuma, to try to encourage greater international cooperation. By that we mean China, European Union, the United States in particularly, but also with Brazil, with India, with Turkey as a new player on the block, to be sure sure that we are working towards a joint goal of economic integration. Immensely important.
I've strategically saved about a minute for each of you before we run out of time, and since you're the experts, I'm going to leave it open-ended, but what I'm going to ask each of you to do is identify some aspect of this discussion or a trend that we should keep watching that is instructive as we try to see how this continues to play out. Nmachi, let's begin with you. You have about a minute.
Sure.
Big question, little time.
I'll be quick. I really like that we touched on the unemployment issue because I think it's a trend that should be watched very closely. It is great what's happening in the technology space in Africa. It's great that there are a lot of positives that's coming out of it, but I think a lot of governments need to embrace ways in which technology can solve the unemployment problem for Africa because, as we know, the demographic trends tell us that it's a very young population, and if a lot of work isn't done into making sure that young people are equipped in terms of education, in terms of training and skills, and in terms of long-term employment opportunities, then the gains that we're seeing from the technology space would eventually not materialize. So in order to really benefit from the positives of technology on the continent, governments on the continent need to embrace ways in which technology can bolster their educational sector and can also bolster employment opportunities for young people.
Okay, thank you. Tim?
Let me talk a little bit about access to the internet in Africa. We've talked a lot about mobile phones and the fact that there are 650 million, at least, of them now in Africa. But access to the internet has not developed nearly as fast. In the Western countries, in the OECD countries, we're increasingly seeing a transition away from voice towards data. And we'll begin to see that in the future years in Africa. Over the last 4 years, we've seen a 20-fold increase in the amount of international bandwidth around Africa.
Steve, the good news is you get the final word. The bad news is we only have about 30 seconds left for that.
I can do it. I think something we've alluded to maybe but haven't said is the informal economy. This talks about the employment issue as well and youth, and this is where technology is having a huge impact. Informal economy is big in Africa, a market-based economy, and just look at the wheelbarrow boys who serve the markets in Monrovia, or the taxi motorcycles and bicycles in markets in Burundi, and you see how the use of technology is really helping them to get the right product to market on the right day, whereas before it was just hit and miss. They just came in with their bananas and brought them to market, and if they ripened and went rotten, then they lost them. So now they can meet needs. So the informal economy is being affected in a dramatic way this way too.
Great. Steven McDonald, Tim Kelly, Nmachi Jidenma, thank you very much for joining us. That's all for this edition of Dialogue at the Wilson Center. Until next week, I'm John Molesky. Thanks for joining us.
We'd like to hear from you. Please send your questions or comments to dialogue@wilsoncenter.org. You can also follow us on Facebook. Search Dialogue Television and Radio. Our host's Twitter feed is twitter.com/John Molesky. Dialogue is a co-production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and MHZ Networks. Dialogue is available via broadcast, cable, satellite, and telco on MHZ Worldview throughout the United States. To see how to watch where you live, visit www.mhznetworks.org.